Okay, hello everyone. It's Thursday morning, 10 a.m. Microsoft Standard Time, and we're here again for our third to last class. If my calendar is correct, we have this week, April 1st and April 8th. So today, Paushini is going to present her work in progress on alienation and the spectacle, but primary focus on the spectacle itself. And what I'd like to do is just sort of as people are kind of logging in, such as Chris, I'm doing this by hand here because my mouse isn't working. There we go. What I'd like to do is sort of kind of quickly go through the readings for this week because they do segue nicely into the material that Maxwell had presented last week regarding urban design and urbanism and so on. And so even though we kind of switched the presentations around, I think there's also enough material in the Lefebvre essay or the chapter Social Space about the spectacle that I think is going to work as well. So just some of the highlights here in this essay, which I found. Actually, I don't know if any of you are belong to, I just call it Gestor, J-S-T-O-R, which is basically a database with lots and lots of really good stuff in all kinds of languages. So you log in. I figured for what you have to pay, I think it's like maybe $19, $20 a month, but every essay, if it's $35 to download, you're getting 9 free ones. So I look at it as a good investment. So the short essay by David Jordan really kind of highlights the issues that we've been looking at over the last two months, 3 months. And there was one passage on the first page on page 99, and he states, pacification through the manipulation of urban space, social control by the artificial creation of real estate values, all accomplished under the intimidating symbolism of imperial authoritarianism. And there's our spectacle again. These go well beyond cavalry charges and clear fields of fire. The urbanization of Paris was nothing less than a transformation of the political and social geography and culture of the capital. And that's within the first, on the end of the second paragraph. So basically that mission statement, right? The main thesis is, how does Haussmann go about doing this? And Haussmann, as the person that he was, simply wanted to impose order on a place like Paris that was really a lot of winding streets, dark little alleyways here and there, which of course, if you're going to have a riot or a demonstration, there are escape routes, right? So that is super helpful. But Haussmann wants to impose order on this particular world. And in particular, what they want to do is cut off the roots. Oh, hang on, Helen just came in. Okay. What Haussmann wants to do is he wants to cut off any kind of connection between what he called the dangerous classes. That was a term actually used by a French historian at the time. The fact that the working class were considered dangerous. They were not only dangerous, they were impressionable, they were turbulent, they could be agitated very quickly and mobilized very quickly. So anything that could be counterproductive to this kind of behavior was considered good. So Haussmann believed that if you could gut the center of Paris, right, you could control Paris and by controlling its center. So by removing that center, a place where people could meet, this would at least minimize or lessen the possibility of demonstrations and protests. Now, there was still the Paris Commune of 1871. And as Jordan points out in here, that has had as much to do with political events and war than it had to do with the actual geography and landscape of Paris at that time. So, and that's on page 100. I'm kind of going through it really quickly here, just waiting for everyone else to log in. And so these sort of visions that Haussmann had of Paris were very specific. He wanted to basically transform it in a way that would be geometric, functional. I mean, functional in terms of transportation of goods and services. More important, transportation of troops, if need be, if there was any kind of insurrection. So the kind of urban renewal that Haussmann was beginning and carried on for some good 20 years, basically it's a rather violent transformation of Paris itself. And the idea of Haussmannization, which is, the French are great for neologisms, and Barthes was even around at this point, but they love to make up words. So the Haussmannization of Paris was this basically straightening out, right? This, imagine a ball of yarn, right, all straightened out in these concentric lines or whatever. And that's really what Haussmann wanted to do. He wanted to basically have it set up so the remaking of Paris was accomplished by the men who knew what they feared and who were able to bring the irresistible might of the state to bear on the city and its population, he says on 102. So it was very much policy planning, very much a desire to do this. And really his MO, as we know, because the kind of the high or low point, depending on your point of view, was of course high modernism. And high modernism, even sort of its seeds are laid in the way that Haussmann used function and utility to create this new Paris. Then on page 104, he talks about how not only did Haussmann do this, but he didn't want to burden taxpayers. So he opened up Paris to economic expansion, capitalist endeavors. And of course, that kind of money was, was what was brought into Paris to pay for this transformation. So we end up having a vested interest in capitalist enterprise simply as a way to pay for it. So ultimately, and for this, the wonderful line from Marx writing in the 18 Brumaire, and he talks about how Haussmann raised Paris to make a place for the Paris of the sightseers. Yeah, that's basically what happened. He turned it into Haussmann, that is, turned it into a tourist attraction. And Haussmann loved uniformity. He loved repetition. And these are ideas that we see repeated in the Situationist work. We see it repeated in Lefebvre's work as well, because the production of Space, the first version of it, came out in 1974. So this is only a year after the SI had closed down. So these ideas are still pretty fresh. And as much as they had a rather acrimonious falling out, Lefebvre and Debord, there's still that influence, that way of looking at that urban landscape that was influenced to a certain degree by the SI, but let's not kid ourselves, the SI were very much influenced by Lefebvre as well. So this is another part I really liked, was the fact that Haussmann had really no taste, no sense of style or anything else. In fact, had no training in architecture. So I just wrote in my note, oh, so did Constant. So it was the possibility that providing you had the right connections, you could get shit done. And Haussmann, literally, there has been no other city in the Western world transmogrified and transformed to the degree that Paris was from 1850 to 1870. And this was a guy who just had good connections, right? Neither an architect, even Constant went to art school, right? But Haussmann had no architectural background, no sense of style or flair. He was all about utility and uniformity. So in the end, on the last page, Jordan points out, and I think there's certainly, given sort of Haussmann's personality that comes through in this essay, was that Haussmann essentially was glorifying himself, right, in and through these buildings that he was creating and allowing to be built, not necessarily in his honor, but I can imagine that would be quite an ego trip to look at something that you thought of or got other people to draw on paper, and you look out the window and there it is. So pretty remarkable that he was able to get this done. So that's basically the article about Haussmann in Modern Paris by David Jordan from the American Scholar, 1992. So helpful certainly in kind of, again, positioning some of these ideas, their history. Haussmann is very important in terms of the way the SI see the sort of negative development of Paris. And then the other essay was a one by Lefebvre, which runs about 100 pages. But the difference between, say, reading an essay by the SI, sorry, and something by Lefebvre is it kind of meanders a little bit more. It's not as taut and concise, lots of examples, lots of sort of detours. But like I say, it was written in 1974 at a time when Lefebvre was still, not that he was reading from getting shot down by Debord, but still was able to look at the ideas that the SI presented and ask himself certain questions on page 73. Is the city a work or a product? Well, he says, ultimately, it is a product of a variety of things because it has to sort of be predisposed for industrialization or capitalist endeavors. But for the most part, he would like it to be considered a work, right? A work in progress. So it's a process rather than a product. And that process is ongoing. It's constantly transforming. But what happens with modernity is that process, right? That positive transformation tends to be sort of uh, subsumed under modernity, looking for repetition, looking for uniformity, looking for function. And it's in the other book, not in the readings, but Marc Augé's book, Non-Places. I don't know if any of you know this one. There's a similar kind of idea that's going on here when Augé talks about supermodernity and what he talks about in terms of excess, right? This an excess of uniformity, an excess of speed with which we travel through these social spaces. So I guess what I'm showing here is that lineage from ideas generated from Hausmann's transformation of Paris, then roughly 60, 70 years later, being sort of revisited by both the Letterist International and the SI, and then Lefebvre is writing at the same time. I think he began writing shortly after the Second World War. The first volume of Critique of Everyday Life came out in 1948. So he had been writing for quite some time, and these ideas are in the air. And I would say that Augé's book and also this other one, which I think we mentioned a few weeks ago, De Certeau, which is the practice of everyday life, same sort of ideas that are going on. And really what I'm asking you to think about is in the Lefebvre essay, the distinction between place and space. We see it in Lefebvre's book, and then De Certeau, as only a Frenchman could say, and I can say that because I'm French, this spaces and places, this is page 117. He says, a place is the order of whatever kind in accord with which elements are distributed in relationships of coexistence. Okay, in English, it's a place where you put stuff. That's really what it is. It's a place where you put stuff and you put other stuff next to it, and it stays there. Because he says, it implies an indication of stability. Yeah, if I come back tomorrow, my shoes should still be sitting right by the front door. It's really fancy, but essentially, and I'm being facetious here, but essentially that's what he's saying. A place has a degree of stability that a space does not, because then he makes a comparison between space. A space exists where one takes into consideration vectors of direction, velocities, and time variables. That's Lefebvre, right? That's the essay Social Space that we just looked at. It has none of the univocity or stability of a proper, right, of a proper place. And then here on page 117, he quotes or mentions Merleau-Ponty, who talks about perception and the geography, what do you call it? The geometry of space. Now, I couldn't find specifically, again, this is this book here, I couldn't find the specific quote, but there were a lot of things in here that were, to me, referring more to that the way in which time seeps into social space, and as modernity begins to constantly make everything look like it's always already there, right? It's been there forever. I think here we can sort of, and what I'm trying to do now is to segue into Pacini's presentation on the spectacle. And there's a passage here on page 26 of Merleau-Ponty's book. To perceive is not to experience a host of impressions accompanied by memories capable of clinching them. It is to see, standing forth from a cluster of data, an imminent significance without which no appeal to memory is possible. To remember is not to bring into focus the consciousness of self-subsistent pictures of the past. It is to thrust deeply into the horizon of the past and take apart step by step the interlocked perspective until the experiences which it epitomizes as if it was relieved of its temporary setting. And then he says, to perceive is not to remember. And there seems to be in the notion of the spectacle that constant there-ness, the notion that we are looking at something and our eyes are occupied by it's either a neon sign, a billboard, some kind of presentation. Lefebvre talks about the phallic verticality of buildings. We're busy looking, right? We're busy perceiving. And the more we perceive, the less we reflect, right? The less we reflect on what it is that we're looking at. And we're busy getting dazzled, right? Dazzled by the shiny objects. And so Lefebvre talks about this. He doesn't mention Merleau-Ponty, but I just want to read that passage from his phenomenology of perception, that while we are perceiving, we're not necessarily remembering. And so that little idea, I think, is what seems to inform Debord in that in your faceness of the spectacle, that we're not busy reflecting, we're simply busy just taking in visually information, but it's relentless, right? Doesn't matter where we turn. No, the world does not look like the set of Blade Runner where we've got, neon signs everywhere, but at its worst, that's kind of what it would be. So I just want to kind of bring up these kind of segues back and forth. I was looking now, Judith isn't here with us, but there's a section here. She's going to be writing on language. There is passages on issues of language, which I thought were really important. But the very last thing I wanted to mention here, of course, I'm going to find it. I made a bunch of, social space signifies, but not in a linguistic manner. This is on page 142. Does it make sense, Lefebvre writes, does it make sense to speak of a reading of space? Yes and no. Yes, in as much as it is possible to envision a reader who deciphers or decodes and a speaker who expresses himself by translating his progression into a discourse. But no, in that social space can in no way be compared to a blank page upon which a specific message has been inscribed. Both natural and urban spaces are, if anything, over-inscribed. Everything there resembles a rough draft, jumbled, self-contradictory. Rather than signs, what one encounters here are directions, multifarious, overlapping instructions. And here we have a revisiting of de Certeau's idea of vectors and intersections. So that space signifies is contestable. But what it signifies is do's and don'ts. And this brings us back to power, right? Do by this, don't go there. Power's message is invariably confused, deliberately so. Dissimulation is necessarily part of any message from power. Any thoughts on the readings at all by anyone else? I've kind of been hogging for the last 15 minutes. Any thoughts on the readings from anyone? Sure, Maxwell, go ahead.
I was surprised at how repetitive Lefebvre was. This is my first time reading him, but I've been hearing about him for years.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was taken aback by how I kept reading it and thinking that there was going to be more. And like, obviously he gets into details and unearths it, but it was surprisingly the same point. And I, like with many Marxists, I found I couldn't quite distinguish between when he's writing and when we're living now. There's this little gap I couldn't quite identify, which I thought was really interesting. I always enjoy that.
Yeah, his writing style is quite different. It's he's constantly posing questions. He's bringing up ideas and he explores them, but in a kind of meandering sort of way. And I mean, for me, one of the most difficult people to read is Derrida. I imagine that a theorist, if you were to reach down in the sort of the soup of the book and pull out the frame and say, here's what he's talking about. With Lefebvre, it's a little bit more difficult. Derrida, there's no frame. It's just one meandering thing after another. But with Lefebvre, there is eventually sort of a point of, not an aporia, but, he presents an idea and we seem to kind of travel historically, hey, let's talk about Venice. Hey, let's talk, and then where did this come from? And all of a sudden the point is made, but it's made in a kind of poetic, meandering sort of way. And then you can see that he's unpacked the idea, maybe not in a direct sort of way. And certainly that writing style is very different than the SI, where it is very terse. There's no room for maybe examples like here's the finished product, as opposed to Lefebvre, who kind of shows you the thought process that allows you to arrive at that conclusion. In SI writing, the thought process is already gone, right? You just have these terse statements that sort of encapsulate the idea. How did you develop that? Where did that come from? With Lefebvre, I get a sense that he may not have a ton of footnotes, but he at least shows us the thought process by which he arrives at that certain conclusion that, here is what I see. I see social space as, traversing of sectors. It allows for economic development, certainly, but the end result now is that we now mistake the interaction that we expect in a social space between individuals now gets modified into interactions between creators of goods and the goods themselves, right? So that relationship shifts ever so slightly. My favorite, though, is in the very tail end, the last page, where I don't know whether it was a dig necessarily at the SI, but he was talking about, okay, so the diversion and reappropriation of space are of great significance. Okay, that would be dérive, psychogeography, for they teach us much about the production of new spaces. And Lefebvre, if you remember the essay, not the essay, but the interview with Kristen Ross, he said, no, the dérive showed us something important, which was the fragmentation of the city. So he says, during a period as difficult as the present one is for a capitalist mode of production, which is threatened with extinction, yet struggling to win a new lease on life through the reproduction of the means of production, it may even be that such techniques of diversion have greater import than attempts at creation or production. Be that as it may, one upshot of such tactics is that groups take up residences in spaces whose pre-existing form, having been designed for some other purpose, is inappropriate to the needs of their would-be communal life. One wonders whether this morphological maladaptation might not play a part in the high incidence of failure amongst communitarian experiments of this kind. Well, I was thinking, well, the ultimate détournement of a building is squatters, right? Squatters that enter into a building, but they don't modify it. They don't put their stamp on it. Now, not to say that squatters are Hegelians. I want to see, myself reflected back in my environment, but he's kind of, it's a dig at people that simply just occupy buildings and really just do that. They don't do anything with the building to make it their own. And so it was one of those odd little passages. And again, I mean, yeah, there's some bitterness. The reason I'm thinking of this, I'm finishing up chapter 4, where I have to deal with the follow between Lefebvre and Debord. And the reader, whoever that person is, said, what are we going to make of the ending? And the ending was a quote from Kristen Ross's essay with Lefebvre, I keep saying essay, interview. And he says, like they just were so angry all the time. They were pissed off and, they were just too hardcore, et cetera, et cetera. And everything started with my book. So the question is, well, what are we going to make of this? So I've been working through letters that Debord had written to friends about Lefebvre, including to Lefebvre himself. And I'm thinking this is roughly 10 years after this has happened. And the fact that he mentions détournement, and it actually does, the word itself is there on the previous page, 167. So he says, a true space does not, true space of pleasure does not exist. But he talks about détournement in a positive way. And then no sooner does he do that, he undercuts it by saying, yeah, but if you're going to try to detour the building, you can't just occupy it. You need to do something else. And maybe that's why these things fail. So yeah, some acknowledgement of the SI, some of the work that was done. And remember, he's also working on his own material, because the SI did or was very clearly influenced by the first volume of Critique of Everyday Life, which came out in 1941. The second volume was done in conjunction with him, and it came out in 1948, first one, 1961, the second one. So of the three that come out, the second one is very much imbued with ideas that was kind of a cross-pollination between the two groups. But it's interesting to see how those ideas still seep in this particular text that was written very shortly after the SI had disbanded. But I think the ideas were still fresh. There's, again, some material in here on the spectacle, which I'm going to look at very quickly as I give the floor over to Paolini. And yes, okay. And this is a section here on page 98, where he talks about, it may be said this space, of this space, that it presupposes and implies a logic of visualization. Whatever the logic governs an operational sequence, a strategy, whether conscious or unconscious, is necessarily involved. So if there is a logic of visualization, the spectacle, here we need to understand how it is formed and how applied. The arrogant verticality of skyscrapers, and especially of public and state buildings, introduces a phallic, or more precisely, a phallocratic element into the visual realm. It posits, presupposes, and imposes homogeneity in the subdivision of space, and ultimately it takes on the aspects of pure logic, and hence of tautology. Space contains space. The visible contains the visible. The boxes fit inside boxes. So this notion of the visualization of a cityscape, and if you're Hausmann, functionality, utility, that's what's important. But that the logic of visualization taken to its extreme, becomes a kind of spectacle. So with that in mind, I would like to hand the floor and the microphone to Payashini. So if there were no other questions on the readings, we're good. And then I'm just going to sit back and listen. So thank you, Payashini, and take it away.
Hi. So I'd just like to thank Max for presenting in my place last week, and thanks for covering me. Um, so I'm going to be talking about the spectacle, but it's not really to do with alienation, but something else. But you will see that as I progress. And also, I just wanted to say that I cannot really see the Zoom video, so I'm going to be reading out something that I've already written, because if I talk spontaneously, I fumble a lot. So if you want to interrupt and say anything, just please feel free to do so.
Okay.
But don't ask me any questions about Hegel. Thanks a lot. Yeah.
Promise not to.
Thanks. All right. So my approach to this paper began with the desire to understand certain aspects of the spectacle. There are certain fundamental things that I can more or less understand about the spectacle, that it is a sort of milieu of appearances that's central to modern capitalist society, and it has an element of falsity to it. It's pervasive, it mediates social relationships, it's autonomous, and it's not subject to human control. And these are some basic features. But what I was specifically interested in when I began working for this paper was the theme of separation. And the reason it intrigued me is that, first of all, it's a term that the SI uses everywhere in their writings about culture, or theory, or praxis, almost everything. And I mean, sometimes they use words like fragmentation instead. Um, but I mean, separation just seems to be a very recurring sort of theme. And secondly, because it seems, especially from some of the more theoretical writings that they've done, that they're going back and forth between terms like unity and separation. And at other times, even if they don't use these exact words, they're hinting towards other dualities, such as appearance and being, even if it isn't an absolute binary. So I think that this is what made me want to understand what exactly is the nature of these separations in the society of spectacle. And in the course of reading, I also realized that the broader problematic of separation is not one single concept or issue across their writing, of course. So separation is of many kinds, theoretically, historically, culturally. But for the sake of this presentation and my paper, my emphasis is going to be on the more theoretical and philosophical aspects of it. And also I think it's sort of important to understand how separation plays out, is because then we can have further clarity on their ideas about history, society, and how they envision things like subjectivity, emancipation, etc. um, so even though I'm beginning here with a very broad general term, it'll become clearer as I proceed that conceptually separation will show up in more specific questions of unity and fragmentation, appearance and being, truth and false, etc. So the text that I'm sticking to, at least for the sake of this presentation, is Society of the Spectacle by Debo. I might take maybe other texts for my paper, but for now I've worked on this one text. Um, so at the outset, the spectacle and this aspect of separation derives from Debo's Hegelian Marxism. And even though most readings of Society of the Spectacle acknowledge Debo's theoretical inclinations, uh, there's a lot of potential to read Hegel and Marx along with Debo's text creatively. So what I'm saying is that just because he's a Hegelian Marxist doesn't mean that there's a singular interpretation of it. And I'm not going to present each and every argument I've come across, because that would take a long time, but I'll just sort of narrow down to the more fundamental ones. Um, so I've gone through a lot of different readings and put together some of them in a way that I can frame some questions and about separation. And methodologically, my reading entails reading one primary text, Society of the Spectacle, along with certain Hegelian Marxist interpretations of it. And for my final paper, I will also be reading Hegel because I just can't avoid that. But for this presentation, my use of Hegel will be limited. So the first thing to understand is in what sense precisely the society of the spectacle that Debo conceives of is Hegelian. In Hegel's phenomenology of spirit, we encounter the absolute. It's a little difficult to define the absolute, but so we encounter the absolute, which is in a sense all of reality, not distinct from consciousness. The whole of reality, the whole of universe, a subject which is its own object, which must realize itself through a process that proceeds by negation. And the penultimate outcome of this process is the realization of a sort of unity of object and object, and thought and being. And so, following Tom Bunya's reading of Debo's spectacle, one of the most appropriate ways of reframing the problematic of separation in spectacle is what he calls subject and object unity. Debo is obviously influenced by Hegel's conceptualization of reality as a process whose end is the absolute's realization of itself. The protagonist of this process is, quote, subjective consciousness continually confronted with objects that appear to be distinct from it, but which are in truth its own alienated self. But Debo does not take Hegel's resolution as it is because it is a resolution that is ideal rather than historical. For Debo, the supersession of the alienation of the subject from object is going to be an outcome of praxis. So, in this sense, Debo's theory can be construed as refiguring the Hegelian absolute as that was a quote, as humanity's currently alienated capacity to shape its own historical time. So, the fundamental separation we encounter in the first instance in Society of the Spectacle is a separation of the subject and object. Having said that, it is also important to understand what kind of resolution this subject-object division, what kind of resolution of the subject-object division does Debo precisely imagine? Because a word like resolution might make one wonder if realizing this unity is a kind of end of history itself. Doesn't mean that all the differences between human beings and things that are abolished and all movement of history and its subjects comes to a halt. The answer, it seems, at least, I mean, so far in my survey of all the literature and everything, is no. And for many different reasons. First of all, Debo retains a distinction between alienation and objectification. And what he wants to supersede is the formal, which means that subject object unity means that the two don't dissolve, but come together in a way that is creative. And I don't really like to use this word, but I couldn't really find another, organic. And secondly, because there are different kinds of readings of what is commonly called the end of history. And they both seems to have taken on a different reading of it, wherein the unity of subject and object uh, uh, the subject and object coming together through the process of revolution or whatever, is only a prehistory, which is a beginning of a different kind of history. So that's all that I'm going to say about Hegel for now. I'm going to move on to the Marxist bits of it. And the first thing I want to talk about is the commodity, and particularly the concepts of use value and exchange value. So this bit is actually quite explicit in the Society of Spectacle. You don't really have to read into the text to determine that it plays a huge role in the spectacle for the go. And I'm assuming most of us already understand use value and exchange value, but I'll just define them quickly. Use value is the use that one can get out of a particular thing, and exchange value is the value one ascribes to it for the purposes of exchange. And so a commodity is defined by this duality of both use value and exchange value. But it is only the latter, that is exchange value, that makes buying or selling of all commodities possible. So in a sense, production and circulation of commodities in capitalist society is enabled by the negation of use value by exchange value. But in the Society of Spectacle, not only does exchange negate use, it gains a historically unprecedented autonomy. And this is what Debord means when he says, especially in the second chapter, which is almost exclusively about commodity, when he says something like exchange value could arise only as a representative of use value, but the victory it eventually won with its own weapons created the conditions for its autonomous part by mobilizing all human use. By mobilizing all human use value and monopolizing its fulfillment, exchange value ultimately succeeded in controlling use. And use has come to be seen purely in terms of exchange value and is completely at its mercy. And in the same, so I'm going to talk about the commodity more, and specifically about the concept of commodity fetishism, which is also something he addresses in the same chapter. Again, to define it briefly, commodity fetishism is a quality of the commodity which makes it appear as self-positing, um, as though the value that it has is the naturalized consequence of something essential to it. And in the process, the labor that actually adds value to the finished product is concealed. And so the reason I'm bringing up both of these, commodity fetishism and value, is because of how significant they are as conceptual sources for Debord's concept of spectacle. This is not to say that the spectacle is totally reducible to these, but that they are key sources for understanding certain features of the spectacle. And I'll explain how. First of all, the text is written with the sense that the commodity form known to 20th century European society um, exceeds what was known to the same society perhaps a century ago, when Marx was writing more than a century ago. And it is not merely the sphere of work that is dominated by commodity in the Bose time, but consumption that has expanded in multiple ways due to the power of commodity. So in the society of spectacle, the commodity has, in Debord's own words, totally colonized social life. And secondly, the central basis of this dominance of exchange value over use is the dominance of abstract over concrete. And the spectacle is a consolidation of that, which is a unity of all that is abstract. For instance, Debord says that the abstractifying of all individual labor and the general abstractness of what is produced are perfectly reflected in the spectacle, whose manner of being concrete is precisely abstraction. So in society of the spectacle, abstraction isn't just dominant over something, it is all powerful because it has gained an autonomy from use. It is coalesced from smaller abstractions to, you could say, one large abstraction. Um, and so what I'm trying to get at is that the structure of the spectacle, I mean, its mightiness, its cohesion, its abstract nature, or is sourced from the status of the commodity that the commodity has reached in modern society. And so the bearing that this has on the problematic of separation is that the alienation that exists between subject and object is suspended in the milieu of the spectacle because of its powers of abstraction. And I clarify that. I mentioned earlier that the Hegelian absolute is a sort of template for the new society that Debord believes we can establish through praxis by historically achieving a subject-object unity. But a unity already exists in the spectacle, which is why the spectacle is a kind of Hegelian absolute, which is ideal rather than concrete and historical. And this is why it is, in a sense, imprecise to say that the spectacle is illusory as opposed to a truth of the world that is out there, implying this binary of appearance and being. Because when you think of it through Hegel and Marx, it becomes clear that the illusion uh, is only one of the capacities of the spectacle, but not the heart of its structure. It does not take what is out there, what is real, and misrepresent it. Rather, it is a unifying mechanism for abstraction that is out there. And one could call it a universal abstraction. This is not to say that, sorry.
I was going to say, just in this idea, without going down the Hegelian rabbit hole, one of the really substantial differences between the absolute and the spectacle is the absolute, ultimately, the way Hegel sees it, is that you would see yourself reflected back in this unity that, as you've pointed out, subject and object, or yourself and you, the exterior world that you have created and built, as you're busy as a slave and finally you're out on your own, etc. The difference is the absolute seems to reflect back in a positive manner the work that the person has put into the world, and you see yourself reflected back. In philosophy of right, I believe, for Hegel, it's being at home in the world, right? This is, I think, section 247, and there's only maybe 260 in the whole thing. This is the endpoint of the absolute, so that we can see ourselves reflected back in the world and we are at home. And yet the spectacle tries to do this, but it misaligns that reflection. That reflection is to Maxwell's is the idea of that concave mirror, right? That black mirror. The reflection back from the spectacle is not a true one. It is one that has now been hijacked by exchange value, hijacked by the exchange of goods. So as much as it tries to reflect, it reflects in a very distorted fashion, and that ultimately leads to a further degree of alienation. But because we may be alienated for 1 second by one object, we turn the corner and we're back to perceiving, right? We're not back to thinking anymore. If Merleau-Ponty is correct, we're busy taking in all the visuality of it all. So I just wanted to point that out to see if you explore that in any way in your paper, how these two appear on the surface to be quite similar, that they reflect back the individual, but in one, in the absolute, there is mediation. The spectacle doesn't ultimately provide that mediation.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess Debo would say that the spectacle is doing, I mean, again, like this is a reading of Debo. This is not Debo's word, I mean, his own words. But I mean, I'm talking about, when I talk about the society of the spectacle, I'm actually almost done. That was my last paragraph. But when he talks about the society of the spectacle, he's actually this reading of this spectacle and also post spectacle society as the absolute, and the process of realizing that this is a reading by Tom Bunyard, which I found very interesting. But I think what he would say is that I think he would disagree with your reading of it, because I think he would say that even the spectacle reflects in a way, I mean, maybe not in the same way that the absolute does, but the whatever reflection or mediation the spectacle provides to any actors in society is satisfactory. I mean, not in the ultimate instance, because it is sort of perpetuating whatever alienation, etc., and disunity and fragmentation. But I think he would say that it's sort of like a perverted absolute, sort of like a
Sure.
perversion of the absolute.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I know Tom Bunyard also talks about the spectacle also involving political structures, that there is that disconnect between reality and what political parties and political institutions concern themselves with. A very good example is south of the border, how they're worried about the gender of Mr. Potato. Meanwhile, 550,000 people have died of coronavirus. I talk about bad priorities. That to me is an excellent example of what Debord means by the spectacle unhinged, right, unmoored from reality. And that's, I think, the way Bunyard looks at the spectacle too, from that political perspective. But yeah, a perverted absolute, I'll go with that. And the only reason why I bring it up is because I know that both Breton, as a surrealist, attended the lectures by Kojève in the 1930s, being held in Paris. And Kojève had a big influence over the way that the French reception to Hegel, for example, and Breton, Kojève, and then much later Debord, although he did not participate in the same lessons, took the same view of history. They wanted history to be open-ended, right? They wanted history to not be the way that Hegel had presented it, which is the culmination of all these series of negations, and then finally we're at home in the world. And so by keeping history open, there was always the possibility of changing course, right? Moving down a different path. And this was something that Hegel did not, I mean, as much as he says the cunning of reason and all these kinds of things, ultimately there is a kind of end of history, right? And liberal democracy is the end point. And Breton said, well, no, historical progress for sure, but we need to keep that future open. And that's why
Right.
when I look at the spectacle, I see that it doesn't open up the future. It tends to constrict the future. It tends to sort of narrow the possibilities, right? Narrow the potentials, in the sense that if ultimately at the end of the day, the only relationships that should be there are relationships of exchange, that doesn't leave us a whole lot of options, does it?
Right. Right. I mean, yeah, and there's a lot of like material on Debord's um, take on Hegel,
Mhm.
but I mean, he did have like certain like strong opinions on Hegel's usefulness for thinking about things like history. So, I
Mhm.
mean, one of the things that's recurring, even though I've not read the history bit a lot, is just that he found Hegel useful because he could think of history as a sort of transformative process. But the only problem being that for Hegel, the absolute can be reached in a sort of a historical fashion, and he wants to historicize everything.
Mhm.
Debo wants to historicize everything.
Yeah, there's, I think the issue with Hegel is the fact that he sits on the cusp of modernity, and I'm not going to quote from from my dissertation, but generally speaking, from the work that I did, my tanglement with him, that was one of the things that I found with Hegel is he looks backwards and forwards at the same time. He presents to us what the world looked like in 1830. And certainly he was not being highly critical. He would point things out and then just leave them, whether he's talking about poverty or exploitation of workers. And of course, these are all threats picked up by the young Hegelians and by Marx. But he stands at a certain point in time, and he says in Philosophy of Right, we are children of our time. And I think Debord really, as time went on, became, no pun intended, became more and more conscious of that, saying, look, we're in a position where we're trying to fight back the powers that be. We're trying to create a new world, but there may only be so much we can do right now. And however dialectically we move slowly forward, there may be only so much we can do in this particular time frame. That's a very Hegelian view of looking at the world. But I think if you were to say, Hegelian / Marxist, I think there was certainly more of Marx than there was of Hegel in Debord's overall perspective. But still, I think you're absolutely right. Hegel's notion of history and historical movements, the fact that we are products of our own history, this is something that Debord never kind of let go of. The notion of having to, to tarry with the negative, right? Whatever is there, that if you're going to think dialectically, every time you change something, you now have a whole new set of circumstances that you need to rethink through, which is, of course, the main criticism he had against the surrealists and the Dadaists, saying that, well, no, you've changed the world in some way, but what you've done is not be aware of it, right? You continue creating these products that reflect a world that is now, at that point, 10, 15 years old. And rather than being historically conscious and aware of, we have changed this, now let's move on to something else. That was something that the SI viewed negatively in surrealism and Dadaism, was the fact that they were kind of stuck spinning the wheels. Once they started, they seemed to present the same idea over and over again. And Debord was trying to, at least at some point, figure out what they had managed to accomplish. Now imagine setting the theoretical foundation for something like a 2-month-long strike in 1968. And what does it result in? Really not a whole lot. So at that point, I think I would argue from 1968 to 1972, you end up having sort of a rethinking and reformulating of what worked, right? What did we do wrong? What can we get right the next time around? And if that's the way they're looking at it, that's now keeping it open-ended, right? It's not that closed sense of history that Hegel has, but in fact an open-ended one, where Marx is saying we continually, yeah, sure, we're going to tarry with the negative, but we need to continually move towards some final goal. And honestly, I don't think Marx ever said anywhere how long this process would take, whether it's 50 years or 1,000 years. I've never been able to find where he gave it any kind of a temporal, endpoint, which I think is in and of itself rather important, because if we think dialectically, each movement forward, we have to recognize it as such and then rethink this new position, right? Let's hold on to this and let's move on to the next one. Current situation, transhumanist Marxism. Okay, so transhumanist Marxism, I will admit I don't know what that is, but it sounds like it's pretty intriguing. Who actually posted that? Peter, was that you that posted that? Yeah. Can you give me a quick background on that to see if we can segue that into our discussion?
Yeah, so the link I posted is from James Steinhoff. Steinhoff's argument is that if we take a Promethean reading of Marx, that is to say, our reading wherein we can change our existence, there's not an essential being to what it means to be human, that we can always adapt and evolve based on our own technological capabilities, that we can change the historical condition that we find ourselves in. And so, like, even if we buy the claim that, like, oh, our present condition is not conducive to revolution, freedom, insert whatever talking point you want, we can materially change our environment to create the conditions for such freedom.
Okay.
And I mean, Steinhoff goes much more deeply into it, but
I'll have a look at that because I've heard the term, and this is sort of me trying to get caught up to what's going on in the 21st century. Is this a fairly recent book?
this, I mean, his article was in 2014, but
Okay.
He's in the FIMS faculty on Western Ontario, I think.
Okay.
But yeah.
Because it's a unique take on Marxism, and certainly still holds on to some of these ideas that we're discussing, that open-ended sense of history, historical movement, of course, movement in history, movement of history, but not closing it off at the end, which makes it that probably more than anything else, not anti-Hegelian, but more leaning towards Marx, and keeping that future as possibilities. Because Paishini, I'm sure that in your readings you noticed several times the idea that there is no future, that the future is already done, and we see this. I think even there's that still beautiful essay by Chechklov, the very first one in the NAB collection, very poetically talking about how the future is already bought and sold. It's done, and so to overcome that and open up these possibilities and these potentialities, really, I think, is what informs, I would say, all of the SI's work, whether it goes from the artistic to the political. I think each time they're trying to create these conditions that Peter's just talked about, conditions under which these things could develop. And each time that happens, we need to sort of stop and rethink, what position are we at? Have we accomplished what we originally set out to do? And where can we go from here? To think that way is much more episodic than it is sort of cumulative, the way that Hegel would have seen it. So I will say enough, and Paishina, I'll let you finish up. That was it? Okay.
I mean, there's a bit more. I just have to look for it.
Sure. Okay.
There's just one point I had to make.
Okay.
Sorry. Yeah. I was basically saying why the spectacle, or how exactly the spectacle is a sort of universal abstraction, and I'll continue from there. And this is not to say that the spectacle itself is a singular homogeneous entity, because it does manifest in many different ways in the day-to-day world, but only that the source of its power is abstraction. Mm-hmm. Having said this, even though the concept itself does not permit us to posit this binary of truth and false with respect to the spectacle, I would say that Depot, as a Hegelian Marxist author of this text, maintains one, in the sense that all of this can methodologically be traced back to a capitalist mode of production and the commodity. So in conceiving of the spectacle, even though there is a detachment of the signifier from the signified in a sense, there isn't a total disappearance of the signified. And there is also still a hope that what is real, concrete, and what is use value can still be recovered. And yeah, I mean, so I don't know. I hope I'm clear enough when I'm saying this, but my point in the last in the end was just that there's a lot of there's a lot of disagreement, whether it is in the secondary literature or just in discussions around the SI, when it comes to the concept of spectacle, about what is appearance, and does appearance mean that it is a lie, or is it, can you sort of make it um, deduce a sort of truth and false binary out of it? And I was sort of addressing that, but I
Mhm.
also realized while reading the text that the reason it can be confusing is because, even though he's suggesting that we've sort of reached a point where exchange can be something completely of its own and completely detached from use in so many instances, he does maintain and he does stick to a sort of whatever a Hegelian Marxist position, which is why he can again trace it back to what really is real, and
Mhm.
which is why I think this confusion of what is true and what is false comes up again and again with respect to the spectacle and the, yeah, that's all.
Yeah, and that's absolutely a very valid and important point, because who gets to define what reality is? And that's, I think, one of the secondary issues that kind of informs his view of it. Because for some, the spectacle is just fine, right? For Jeff Bezos, the spectacle is wonderful. That he lines his pockets with it. But for us, as we are the subjects, right, the spectators of the spectacle, the position we have relative to it is a very different one. And I think the notion, you can see as you do the readings, I've gone through this material a couple of times working on the book, is I look for the earliest point at which they use the word spectacle, and it starts as something pretty innocuous. It's like what Lefebvre talks about, the facade of a building, right? It's imposition upon our sight lines, our visual lines or horizons and so on, and it starts that way. But over time, and the argument I make in the book is that they're a little bit like symbolists, in the sense that they see something and they view it with an idea. And in this case, it becomes the way in which the spectacle kind of gets in the way, right? It gets in the way of relations with, in this case, relations with just looking at the horizon, right? It starts as simple as that. And the more they seem to think about that notion of imposition, or, getting between something, I think that's where the seeds are laid for Debord to explore this further, because Van Eeghem uses the same term, Kayati uses the same term, and it becomes kind of something that is of greater concern as time goes on. And so finally, Debord writes about it explicitly. But it does start as a kind of imposition between relations. And what happens is, as it grows and develops and becomes more powerful, because now it becomes harnessed to economic endeavors, and now it gets, next thing you know, it gets harnessed to mass media. The way in which the spectacle intervenes and modifies these relationships that we try to have with one another, because we're both late for work, so we're going to say hi, bye, we're going to grab a quick coffee, and off we go. Well, the spectacle is that you need to work. The idea you need to carry on is, I need to be at work. So suddenly, small things like the time you spend with someone, right? The imposition from above of the spectacle saying you should be working. This is who you are. You are primarily a consumer. You should be out making money to buy things. As time goes on, they seem to really be greater. Well, there's a greater and greater concern with the spectacle, not as something above or behind, but in a sense in between, right? In between
Imminent,
people.
yeah.
Yeah, exactly. That is imminent. And so that's the first thing. There is another book that Debord wrote, sort of the commentary to the spectacle, where it's kind of even more frightening, because it's really where we're at now. And he says, once corporations harness media, that spectacle becomes even more pervasive and powerful, because suddenly now discussions and commentary and ideas and alternatives get mediated through media, right? Through these other voices, these official voices. And he says, once that happens, we are really fighting an uphill battle. And so in the commentary, he does go back on some of the ideas which were in 1967, what he thought at that time as a good Hegelian boy, I'm a child of my time, and then goes back and looks at it and says, wow, this has gotten worse. Now he talks about media. He talks about globalization. These are things that now, concern us very greatly, because we see that what he's as was talking about back in the 70s, we see it sort of coming to fruition. The fact that there used to be, this is something, there's a slide I showed in one of my communications classes, in the 1970s, there were 98 different companies that owned maybe, let's say 150 different media outlets. Now it's 4, right? Literally 4. So those 4 corporations own our voice, right? Or at least if they don't own our voice, they control what gets talked about, right? What gets disseminated. And once you can make those choices, at the worst, right, you can kill stories that could be, present someone in a bad light, politician, sports figure, whoever, but they also control the narrative, right? And this is something we've said before, controlling the narrative. That's kind of the spectacle as Debord saw it at a later date, the way in which media works together with corporations to get in between ourselves and happiness, freedom, options, right? Opportunities. As students right now, I mean, the spectacle that you hold over your heads is one that you're going to get into the workforce with massive debt. And that will now control Helen's very sad. I'm very sorry to remind you, don't take it my way, which working at a factory, I almost killed myself. But anyway, regardless, when you enter into this exchange, knowledge, you go to school for X number of years, if there is anything resembling a meritocracy anymore, there's a chance to get a job, etc. Helen, I don't want to depress you, but you get what I mean. You leave with an education, but you're carrying this millstone behind you called student debt that really curtails your options. And so if that's the case, the spectacle, presents to you like, be responsible, right? Get that job, but you got to pay off the debt. You've got to be a good person. So Debord, by the 70s, was seeing how the spectacle was seeping down more and more, and it was no longer just the state. I mean, we have Hegel talking about the state in a positive way, right? What is the state? It's God walking on earth. Philosophy of right. Then we've got Marx saying, the state needs to be, the workers could control the means of production. We're going to dissolve the state, et cetera, et cetera. The anarchists, the same thing, smash the state. But we're at a point now where the state is not the way we saw it 50 or 100 years ago, or even, 150 years ago, to go back to Marx. It's all pervasive, right? The state now seeps down into everyday life, and not only does it get in between exchanges between human beings, it gets inside our head, right? We start thinking about that student debt. We start thinking about the options that we have, or the limitations of options that we have. So Debord was quite aware that there was that very real possibility that between globalization and corporate media, we were really going to be given very few options to think otherwise. And I'm not saying, live under the radar. Some people want to do that. But the options that we have to get around it, for under it and so on, it's no longer just a state. It is this behemoth, right? This behemoth that has really no ends, right? We don't know how far we are. Mark Fisher calls it capitalist realism, right? I would call it the same, different word for the spectacle. The fact that we have this world that no matter what we try to do to fight against it, somehow commodification will package whatever revolt you've got, right? And that's kind of not depressing, it's more difficult, but the options that we have now to fight back become fewer and fewer. Social media, would be a great option. You have to remember, I was around before any of this. So it's a kind of a cool place to be, because, as a teenager in the 70s, computers, like, what, right? There was the size of my room, right? And then all of a sudden just get smaller and smaller. I'm waiting for them to implant them into our brain. That's just a matter of time. But the notion that I can see the before and after, the internet is this fantastic tool, this revolutionary tool, but people are just busy talking shit about each other. And it's kind of not what it was for, right? So we could use social media as a means to, by which to get around or circumvent the, these kinds of issues. But again, I don't own Facebook. I don't own TikTok or Instagram or whatever. So even there, those avenues, those avenues of public discourse are still owned by somebody, right? It's still to somebody a commodity. And of course, if you actually spent the time reading, the fine print of Facebook, they own everything you create. So even if you created something that was, demonizing Zuckerberg, he's a lizard person. So what? He'd laugh and go, great, I own it. At which point they take it down. So we can laugh at it, which I think is maybe not a bad thing. It's a postmodern thing to do. But I think with Debord, he saw increasingly that this was going to be a serious problem. And once you harness these other powers where you've got politics, economics, media, all kind of seeping together into this one homogenous blob called the spectacle, that's where Bunyan, I think, says, in absolutely, he's correct, is the spectacle itself, although even it interacts in those ways with these other fields, it still at times seems to be unmoored from the reality that we live, right? The reality of student debt, the reality of limited options, the reality of the hard work we've got to put in that we may or may not be successful. And then at which point you say, well, hey, I'll get to define what is successful. If I can pay a bill when it comes out that day, I'm rich. Okay. As opposed to, oh, the spectacle says you need to own at least 12 yachts and 18 helicopters. I don't need that. If I can pay a bill today, I'm rich. So if we take back what we think is important and we take back what we consider to be goals in our lives and we fit them towards, a realistic expectation, whether they're humanist or otherwise, we might be able to navigate through this. But certainly Debord was under no, misapprehensions that this could be something that could be overcome. He was pointing it out, and certainly, to fight back against instrumental rationality, to fight back against reification by, engaging in the dérive and détournement and the rest of it. It didn't seem to be enough. And as he revisited these ideas in the 70s, realized very quickly that, there's far more serious issues that are going on. And the one that really concerned him greatly was globalization and corporate media. The two things that we now have, that are of great concern to us. Now, you could be like Baudrillard, who says, terrorism, that's a response to globalization. What? Okay. That's one way to look at it. I don't know if it's correct, but the way in which others are fighting back to stake their claim and keep that little chunk of land as their own. Okay, however you do it. But yeah, Debord was very clear on understanding that this was going to be an ongoing problem and likely made worse as it learned to work kind of behind the scenes, because it both gets in between us, our relationships, but at the same time seems to really be the horizon line. The new horizon line is capitalist realism, right? Mark Fisher's idea. It is there. And I certainly, I don't have the answers, but I know that it's something we need to identify and see how it works. But the more we look at it, maybe there will be some kind of Northwest Passage out of this thing, because really that's ultimately what we're looking for, a way out into something else. Now, what that something else is, that's what's up for grabs, right? That will be definitely trans post-humanist. I bet you there is some trans post-humanist somewhere. But yeah, did anyone else have any thoughts or comments on Piaschini's presentation? Maxwell, go ahead.
This is a little bit out from left field, but Piaschini, I was wondering if you felt that attention and maybe the attention economy could be discussed in terms of dialectics, or maybe not can it, but is it useful to stick within this dialectical language to talk about attention?
Do you want me to talk about dialectics specifically or just the general framework of the spectacle?
Either or. I'm just like, for the spectacle, I mostly think of attention economy just for my own interests on this. And
right. There's an interesting book called I think the cinematic mode of production. Have you heard of it?
No.
Yeah. So it's called the cinematic mode of production, and it actually takes borrows the framework from Society of the Spectacle, but talks about attention economy and surveillance, and I mean all of the things that can be reaped from the attention economy. But I mean, I'm not sure if we can talk about it in terms of dialectic specifically, but with respect to the spectacle, yeah, with respect to the spectacle, I definitely think the attention economy is one of the more contemporary, I don't know, sort of an imminent sort of network of power or whatever, like a new sort of sociality. So yeah, I do think that the attention economy is, I mean, definitely, yeah, very, very relevant when it comes to the spectacle in a more contemporary context. Yeah, I mean, is there something more specific you want me to talk about?
No, I'm just always skeptical of dialectics, and since that's really at the core of
Okay.
this, I wanted to put pressure on it
Right.
because I feel like I'm always missing the crucial
Right.
part of it. But it's not really an entirely fair question, so I acknowledge that.
No, but I mean, I can definitely think about it. I think it's very interesting because um, I'm not a huge fan of dialectics myself. I mean, I sort of got indoctrinated into philosophy, the Deleuzian route. And it's only now that I'm sort of exploring Hegel and Marx and the other side of it. But I'll think about it as I read Hegel's primary text, and maybe I can get back to you.
Great, thank you.
Does anyone know this book here, Downcast Eyes? This is actually the disintegration of, the denigration of vision in 20th century French thought. So we've just finished talking about visualization, right? The visualization of culture. And yet Martin Jay compares Foucault's the panopticon, right? The surveillance society versus Debord's, well, the spectacle. Now, the spectacle is not surveillance necessarily, but it does try to create opportunities. Of course, if you spin it as positively as you could, the fact that the spectacle gives you potentialities and possibilities, but always linked to the purchase of commodities. If you want to do this, buy that. And so the fact that vision has been denigrated, which if you go back to the history of philosophy, vision was primary, right? It was the sense, the sense source, right, for sense data. And the fact it's been denigrated throughout the 20th century, and the fact that Debord ends up in this book is saying a lot about how vision has been corrupted and perverted and polluted in this way, whether it's the concave mirrors or whether it's the spectacle. But again, this intrusion, the way in which we filter reality through all these different mechanisms that we need to exist within, whether above, below, whatever, but within. It's interesting that vision is ultimately denigrated. Paushini, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, so since we're talking about vision, what I found very interesting is that, I mean, I have to be honest. I mean, at the outset, the spectacle seems very, very straightforward. I mean, the concept of it at least seems very simple and straightforward. But what I was interested in, and I guess that's probably the reason that I went the Hegelian Marxist route, I took that, I mean, that particular course of research in asking these questions, is that there are some readings of Marx that are sort of looking at some concepts of Marx, specifically things like theory of value, and specifically I'm talking about Eric John Russell. So he's actually talking about the theory of value in Marx, and Marx actually uses words like appearance, and when he's using words like appearance, so for instance, in that very famous example of 20 yards of linen can make a coat. I think it's something like that.
I think Capital Volume 1, maybe.
Yeah, I'm not sure where it is, but I think the essay is called Value Form. So 20 yards of linen is equal to one coat. And he says that the use of one kind of commodity here, is sort of like, how do you say, producing another commodity. And so the equivalence that it reaches, by virtue of being, I mean, by virtue of being, turned from whatever, a raw material to a finished product, is actually a form of appearance. And he uses the word form of appearance, it's translated from German. And so this appearance is not simply a sort of false appearance. This is something that we sort of entails, the faculty of vision, but not necessarily in the sense that we see 20 yards of whatever material, and we see a coat, or we see a coat and we see some material. But that sort of transformation, I think that's what he's trying to get at. Um, that sort of transformation entails, I think, sort of brings being to a certain level, which is why when he says something like form of appearance, he's not saying that this is a sort of false representation of this raw material into a finished product, or the finished product into raw material, but that these are the many form of appearances of this one commodity. And which is why, you can say money is the great equalizer, not in the sense that money brings everything to the same level, but that money is that sort of universal abstraction of value.
Mhm. It
So
becomes like a
money is a sort of
universe.
concrete sort of outcome of every abstract value in the world.
So if we
Yeah.
talked about a
So
signifier, signified, and a referent, the referent is always is a stack of bills. And I know what you mean. It's again being very facetious, but really ultimately the referent is its monetary worth, right? Because and Marx, again, when he talks about the form of appearance and the yarn becoming a quote a coat, it's us being able to envision it in a different form, right? It's still wool, but it's now presented in a different form. And a different form is something in the future. We can still understand it. It makes sense. But in its present condition, it is simply a ball of yarn. But we can imagine it much in the same way as people, when they look at homes that they want to purchase, if you ever get to that, I'm saying in the future, but hopefully you will, when you go to purchase a home, you imagine yourself living in it, you imagine yourself doing renovations and so on, but you are still always looking into the future. Now, again, the great equalizer is what's this going to cost? But to get back to Marx's point, you're right. The great equalizer still is money in the sense that the exchange value is exactly that. What is this thing worth? And can I now, extract as much profit from it because it cost me this much to make it? What will the market bear? How can I hide the labor within this product? And we look at certain things. I think it's Adam Smith in Wealth of Nation says, why are people so preoccupied with these little shiny rocks that live in the ground when water is what matters? Why do people spend so much money on diamonds and yet water is abundant everywhere? Well, that was 1776. Now we've got a problem. But he looks at something, okay, something of value. What paradigm are you using to assign to it value? Does it keep us alive like air and water? Or is it a bauble, right? Is it a diamond? So when Marx uses value, clearly it's always use value, exchange value, surplus value, all these issues which are very, very, very clear, but always point to something in the future. This thing will eventually be worth this much. We need to put this much labor into it. I don't know if that takes us away from the spectacle in any way, but certainly when Marx, as you point out, when he talks of appearance, it's always in its final state, right? If he wants to be teleological about it, we'll say, the end point of this ball of yarn will be a coat worth this much. Maybe that's kind of the Aristotle influence in some of his work that you can still see, right? Teleologically speaking, that's where we're at. Teleology, though, when you talk about the spectacle, that could be terrifying because we don't know what the end point is going to be. Total control, and we're going to live in the matrix. I hope not. But at the same time, when we think about the reality of globalization and corporate media, that is something that we are living with right now and having to deal with. How is it that governments can allow companies, after they've funded them with millions and millions of taxpayer dollars, allow them to leave town and set up somewhere else? Like, this should have happened once and people would have gone insane, but it didn't happen. It just, by the time we knew, it was a done deal. So there's a spectacle distracting us about, something else is going on. And while the left hand has got a shiny object, the right hand is doing something else. That's another way the spectacle works, right? Through distraction and preoccupying us, Mr. Potato and Dr. Zeus books and things like that. Like, who cares? Honestly, who cares? Well, apparently some Republicans do, but we would like to get credit for the vaccine, even though we had nothing to do with it, et cetera, et cetera. We can think of all kinds of examples, but at its worst, certainly the spectacle does function at times to distract us, right? It presents us a distorted view of who we are, distorted view of our reality in our life, but also it distorts, what else is happening at the same time. Pavishini.
So the argument that I was talking about wasn't clear enough, but I just wanted to say that the author is actually trying to argue why money is a spectacular thing, and I just realized that Debo's writing this text, I think 1967, right?
Yeah.
Or 67, yeah. And what is interesting is that one of the central questions in post-colonial, I've not really done any post-colonial studies, but one of the central questions in post-colonial studies is, when we're looking at colonization retrospectively, is that we're wondering how exactly is it that a certain mode of production, which sort of came from a completely different part of the globe, and entered an area where, you essentially did not need this new mode of existence to survive because you already were surviving.
Yep.
So how is it that this particular mode of production, if you look at it through Marx or whatever, it just seems obvious that, of course, feudalism is going to be followed by capitalism or whatever. But, when you're trying to look at it historically, you're trying to determine how could this happen at all, because it's not that there was a need-based relationship between what is now the third world and the first world, but we were colonized and then we were sort of brought into the system, right, through colonialism. So I think it would be very interesting to think of money as a spectacular thing, and also the spectacle being as powerful as it is by virtue of whatever new heights the commodity had reached in the 20th century. And I'm not saying that that's why colonialism happened, but it would be interesting to look at it, sort of put them together, because he is making some very interesting claims about the commodity. And so, of course, this would not be an economic sort of answer to it, but it would be an interesting cultural, superstructural sort of line of inquiry for things like colonialism, because the commodity form is not just dominating an already capitalist society, but it's also able to make an appeal to, non-capitalist societies. Yeah, that's all.
Well,
but again, I'm not speaking for the whole world. It's like my part of the world.
No. But as you were discussing it, I was thinking of back in the 90s when I was taking my women's histories course at York. Marilyn Waring was the author of a book that we read called "If Women Counted," and it was this excellent example inside where, as you were discussing, with colonialism, very shortly after it becomes industrialization, and the UN decided to set up a committee to figure out, how these developing nations in North Africa, that was the example, in Kenya in particular, how they could help themselves. So somebody sat down and thought, if they could grow coffee, I think that would be a great export, a great commodity. And of course, the book is called "If Women Counted." No one bothered to ask the indigenous population there, primarily women that worked in the field, what they thought of it. They didn't. So instead, they're growing coffee in Kenya, exporting it, right, to the developed nations. Meanwhile, they're going hungry and they can't figure out why. Well, yeah, because you're growing coffee, for crying out loud. You can't eat it, right? And this is, again, to me, I'm trying to shoehorn this into the spectacle, and watch me crash and burn here, but let's do it. So the spectacle is this notion of helping, right? The fact that we're going to, bring UN aid to Kenya, and it looks good, right? So we got ribbon cutting ceremonies, and we've got people in suits, and everything looks really good. This is great. But then it falls flat in its face when they decide to grow something that is not edible. So it doesn't sustain the population. They go hungry, and yet others become very wealthy as a result of it. And the reason why the book is called If Women Counted is it's a series of these really colossally stupid ideas that the UN and other government or agencies did, thinking they were helping, right? So they come along and, however they arrive and proceed to do this without ever stopping to think about what are these specific conditions under which these people live. What is the reality of these people? Well, we have very little arable land, right? It's very hot and dry, little bit of arable land, and we try to grow food to keep ourselves alive. So Pashini, to your point of saying, they were alive before. So along comes not only colonization, but then capitalism to make them money. Well, clearly, I don't think anyone made a nickel other than maybe getting paid for planting the coffee beans. And that's where it ended. They still went hungry, and yet others made a ton of money. So that example, this was, I think, 1995, I took that class. So 25 years later, 35 years later, no, 25, sorry. It's still in my mind. It's still stuck in my mind as an excellent example of the colossal stupidity of people that have the power to do things and yet never stop to think of it in realistic terms, right? It'll look good, right? It's a PR campaign. The spin doctors or the ever popular, well, how's that going to look? Whenever you hear politicians, how's that going to look? To me, they're thinking of the spectacle, right? That's not going to look good. Or my favorite these days, the optics aren't good on this one. The optics aren't good on this one. There's a spectacle, right, creeping up in literally everyday language where we start speaking visually about things, things not looking good, or the optics on a particular form of behavior not being good. That's, again, us being conscious of, being reflected back, however distorted through that, the spectacle that is corporate media. But the issue of, Kenyan coffee, that's where that comes from. And it's just the colossal stupidity of an organization that has literally no anchorage in the reality of those individuals, who live there, how they're going to feed themselves. You've taken all the arable land and are growing coffee on it. I can't eat that. So to me, it's a good example, but it just really shows, how misguided these ideas may be of helping, but just utterly detached, right? Utterly detached from the reality of these individuals. Did anyone wish to add any more? Paishini, did you have any concluding statements? We're good? Okay. Looks like everybody's fine. Everyone okay to pack it in early today? Sure, Peter, go ahead.
Yeah, so then just a quick question not related to presentation, but how married are you to the idea that the paper is due on April 7th?
Not 100%. It's not etched in stone. It's not written on an Etch-a-Sketch either, but it's if you need some flexibility, that's cool. I'm okay with that. Put it this way, just between you and I, right? Nobody else is seeing this. My marks don't have to be until May 10th. Okay, so just be okay on that. So May 10th. So that gives you a little bit of wiggle room. So let's say you need a week. I'm okay with that. Just let me know if that's going to work for you, because you're probably all working as TAs or teaching courses. You're going to have a ton of marking to do at exactly the same time. I don't know, Helen, if you heard that. Okay, fantastic. Many likes. Okay, so that's cool with me. Just let me know if it's going to take a little bit longer, and I can certainly accommodate for it. But I have a meeting I think the first Monday in May to just basically discuss the course with the head of the department, but my marks don't have to be in until the 10th. So that gives us all a little bit of room. And my due date for my book is April 5th. I have my conclusion to do. After that, I've got lots of spare time. I will be so happy because it's really cool to have a book, but man, is it a lot of work. Anyway, I digress. So yes, to your point, Peter, there is some wiggle room. So let me know if you need it, and we can work around it. I just want to make sure that the Dropbox doesn't close. So what I may do is I may just move it, let's say a week and a half already from the original date of, what was it, the 5th, I think? Or
Yeah.
the 5th. Okay, I'll move that ahead by about a week and a half right now to leave it open. If you get in on the 5th, fantastic. If you need a little bit more time, just let me know. Hey, it's going to take a few extra days because I'm not under any apprehensions that you've got, this is the only course and you have no other life. All of us have got lots of other things to do. So well, we can work around that. Was there anything else that's everyone seems to be kind of okay? Rare to get outside. It's a beautiful day. It has been a beautiful day. So I need to probably do a little bit of work in the backyard, but if everyone is cool, we're just going to pack it in early. And we'll see each. Well, I've recorded this, so it better be recorded. But we'll see each other next week. Now, next week is going to be kind of a full schedule. Helen will be presenting. Now, the gendered, well, détournement or dérive and the gendered body is still kind of the working title at this point, more or less. Okay, and again, you don't have to adhere to it. And then Judith will also be presenting her ideas on language and the interests or the theories on language that are generated from the SI. So we'll have a double bill. I probably will not present anything by way of talking about the readings. I'm going to go back and take a look to see what there is to be read for next week. I think I've already kind of trimmed it back so that we have time to present both, both presentations. But I will double check that. But definitely today you'll see the due date for the last paper moved at least a week and a half. So something closer to probably like the 15th or something. And again, if any of you need a little bit more time, just quick email to let me know. Okay, cool. Everything is right on, and have a wonderful weekend, and we'll see you next week. Take care. Bye.